or I think, are we ready to start?
Yeah, that's
Good. Well, it is indeed a pleasure for me to introduce my good friend and my mentor, Dr. Berthold Lowenfeld. And Dr. Lowenfeld has made so many contributions to this field it would be impossible to name them all. He certainly is a world-renowned scholar, lecturer, and a leader to us all. So it's my pleasure to introduce him today, and we're so thrilled you could be with us.
Thank you very much, Sally. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm particularly glad to be in Sally's class this time, because I have known Sally from many years back, when she was a student at the California School for the Blind, and I was superintendent there. And Sally was an excellent student. I don't give you any secrets away. And we had great hopes for her, and she certainly has fulfilled all the hopes that we had and her parents had, and she had for herself too, I hope.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm very glad. It's a rare opportunity for someone to speak in a former student's class. She has asked me to talk to you about the changing status of the blind. And that's a topic that is close to me. Some of you may have read some parts of my book, or may have looked over the whole book. And I'd like to give you a general idea about it, and we'll pick out certain areas on which you might have questions, and I might have no answers, but I can react to your question, and that's all I can do. The book itself, or the topic itself, lends itself to a division in two parts. The first part would be a historical review, because in order to understand where we are now, we have to go back to the roots of the development of education and status of the blind in general. I think Phil has said sometimes in one of his speeches, only if we know the past can we understand the present and be prepared for the future. You say,
I probably stole it from somebody.
And this is the main reason why I am going into historical details. Well, there is very little known about the early treatment of blind people in the primitive societies. Why do you think is there very little known about it? Very little tangible material available.
No written records.
No written records, yes. There are no written records. Well, how else can we know then about it? If there are no written records, we really don't know much. And that's true, we don't know much. But we can know something. And think for a moment, how would we be able to draw certain conclusions, and what would be the basis on which we can build our conclusions?
Word of mouth?
Pardon?
Word of mouth?
Well, if there would be a word of mouth possible from 2,000 or 3,000 years or 4,000 or 5,000 years back, it would be a very good thing. But they didn't have anything like our VCRs or anything like that. So we can't get anything by word of mouth.
Drawings?
Pardon?
Drawings?
Drawings might be one source, but in our case we have no drawings. But you are getting closer to it.
Assumptions, I mean, you could pretty much determine, you knew pretty much the age span that people lived at that time, talking back like prehistory or pre-recorded history, so then you could understand that they foraged for food and they had to hunt for food. So originally the prairie person would have a much more difficult time in securing food and securing, shelter.
Yeah, we can, but these are already conclusions. Well, there are certain primitive societies even nowadays. And from the way in which these primitive societies that we can observe right now, if we want to, we can find out how they still treat their blind or visually impaired people. And there is a variety of treatments, and from that we can conclude that there were actually in the prehistoric antecedents are not very clear, because some primitive societies now deal with the blind in a kind of a human or humane way, while others are still on the basis, treat with them on the basis of it's better for them not to exist. And this radiates into historical time already, because we have in historical time among the Romans, among the Greeks, among the Egyptians, we have certain examples that are already written down, or at least traditionally available. Now, the treatment varies, as I said, and it varies largely between the idea of annihilation and veneration. You know, on the one side, the early Spartans, for instance, set out the blind babies in the Tigris Mountains near Sparta, and left them to nature, and nature took care of them. On the other hand, there are in the almost contemporary Roman society and Athenian society, the blind were treated with a kind of veneration. Now Homer, the great Greek epic writer, was traditionally considered blind. How blind he was, we don't know. But he was considered the blind bard among the Greeks. And he was venerated by everyone. And in Rome you had the same thing. There were lawyers, there were speakers, there were politicians who were blind and were venerated. But actually, annihilation, which is separation of the blind from the stream of society, because it was not always extreme annihilation, it was just separation. And in this process of separation, the blind were actually and virtually separated from the stream of society. While, on the other hand, veneration also separates, because it puts them on a pedestal, and there they stand outside of the stream of life. So we have historic antecedents which indicate that the treatment of the blind faltered between separation, complete separation, and sometimes annihilation, and veneration. That means admiration, which also separated. Now, in this separation, as I said, we have the two annihilation and veneration extremes. But there is in between another way, beggary, in which the blind could just have or acquire the bare and very bare necessities of life and get along with them. And sometimes this beggary not only prevailed in the primitive societies, but carried over in the more developed societies also. Now, this separation of which we have only comparative knowledge, and the knowledge is not direct one, but an indirect one, this separation was, this period of separation, say, was replaced by a status that I have called the ward status of the blind, W-A-R-D, where they became wards of society. Now, this change came with the growth of the monotheistic religions, where the idea that we are all children of one God prevented extreme treatments, and people began to think of people who are different, and the blind are different, were different for them, of course, began to think of them as people who need support. Now, the Hebrews demand, and those of you who know more about the Old Testament know that in the Old Testament, the idea was that the blind should be protected, that you should remove the rock or the stone from the path of the blind. In Hebrew society, the family was responsible for all the members of the family. And this also made the family responsible for its blind members. And this was already great progress so far as the treatment in primitive society was concerned. This status of war was retained for many centuries. And the New Testament made one very considerable contribution in the change of the status of the blind. Because when Christ was asked whether a blind person should be considered responsible for his blindness, and the interpretation of the source of blindness was that some sinning of fathers or mothers or parents and grandparents is responsible for the person's blindness. Jesus Christ changed that idea and said, no, this man is not responsible for his blindness. You as well as I can have it. And that changed. Blindness was not anymore considered a result of sinning and a documentation of guilt, but was considered something for which the individual is not responsible. Now this you would have to recognize as a great change, because it took away the onus of guilt, the onus of something in a person's antecedents that up to the time of Christianity, even in the Old Testament, was a burden that the blind had to bear. Of course, we find even now traces of this, because some people who are not enlightened about blindness still think of the people, the blind person, being responsible for himself or herself. There was a book that I remember that was published in the 1940s by the American Foundation for the Blind, and it had the title, "It is not my responsibility," and the story of a blind person. I think you remember that book, Sally? It is not
I'm not
my,
connecting
it is
with
a
that
little
title.
it's not exactly that title,
We'll look it up though and let
It
them
is,
know.
pardon?
I'll look it up
Yeah,
and we'll let
it
them
is
know.
not my choice or something to that effect. But it shows that this is still a potent influence. Now, during the Middle Ages, that are commonly called the Dark Ages, you don't expect any progress in the status of the blind, because at that time, very little progress was made altogether. The 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century are centuries of little human progress. And the blind remained within the ward status. That means they were considered responsibility of either the family or a wider group of society. But they certainly were not supported in a way that would give them any claim to independence. Now, at the time of the Enlightenment, of the French Enlightenment, which really became an enlightenment of the world, the number of blind people who showed that they can be successful increased. And I have called this the era of self-emancipation of the blind, because it was largely the blind themselves who emancipated. Yeah, now title comes back. It was not my own idea. That's the title of the book. It was not my own idea to be blind, you see. So it's still implied that somehow it can be your own idea. Now, to jump to the time of self-emancipation, there was a growing number of blind people who showed by their achievement that the blind are capable. And in my book, if you want to look it up, you will find a number of these blind people mentioned, and they became the carriers of self-emancipation. The blind self-emancipators are numerous, and they showed in various fields what blind people can do. To give you only a very few examples, Dr. Nicholas Bacon in the 17th century was a philosopher who acquired his law degree at the University of Brussels and became an outstanding lawyer and advocate of the Council of Brabant, which was at that time the ruling council in Belgium. Thomas Blacklock, a Scotsman who lost his sight through smallpox, and that turns up to be the most frequent cause of blindness among these self-emancipators. These were not people who were born blind, but most of them became blind early in life through smallpox. And we will come later on to medical progress that also helps to alleviate blindness, because it reduced the number of blind people. Then there was a man by the name of, well, going back to old Alexandria, Didymos of Alexandria was one of the earliest Greek blind scholars who were revered. John Fielding, the brother of Henry Fielding, the famous British author Tom Jones, if you remember. Well, he was a very capable man in his own right. He lost his sight when he was 19 years old and became a travel agent, which sounds strange because it was in the 18th century, but people traveled at that time, and he was well known as a man who is acquainted with lots of foreign countries, and he gave advice to a lot of other people. He was knighted and became known as Sir John, the blind beak, he was called. Then there is a man by the name of François Huber, Huber, Huber. Huber because he was in the French part of Switzerland, and he became totally blind as a result of cataracts and apparently TB, tuberculosis. And he was an expert in beekeeping and wrote a treatise on bees, which the great Belgian author Maurice Maeterlinck considered as the basis of all research on bees. So you can see already from this enumeration of the few that I have given you, and there are many others whom I mention shortly in my discussion, like Sanderson, Nicholas Sanderson, blind from smallpox, became a mathematician. And he was the first Newtonian professor appointed by the Royal, a fellow of the Royal Society, a very highly regarded mathematician. And there are lots of others. But they paved the way for the idea that was uncommon at that time, that blind people could be educated. And I call these, and I want you to remember that, the self-emancipators among the blind, who showed up during the 18th century, but before that also. But the accumulation of these self-emancipators convinced many of the people that blind people are educable. Among those who were convinced was particularly the famous French author and encyclopedist Diderot, who wrote his Letter sur les aveugles, the letter on the blind, which became a classic in our field, one of the first enlightened treatises on the blind. This letter of Diderot influenced Valentin Houillet, the founder of the first school for the blind in Paris. He wanted to demonstrate on a few blind pupils that he could educate. And he started with a small group of blind students, which developed later into the first French school for the blind. In this school, Louis Braille was educated and trained. And Louis Braille, who lived from 1809 to 1852, didn't become old, but he made the greatest contribution because he gave to the blind a means of communication that has outlasted more than 150 years by now, and is still the most efficient and the easiest way for blind people to communicate with themselves and with others in written form. This foundation of the first school for the blind in Paris and the invention of Braille were the beginnings of integration. Because without education, integration would be impossible. Education took first the form of separated schools. And there are many reasons why it took that form. Let's probe a little bit into these reasons. Why the first schooling for the blind was provided in residential schools. Now, can you find out one or the other reason for that? And think that was back by the end of the 18th century. Yep.
Because it's such a low incidence.
Pardon?
Because it's a low incidence facility, and there could be only a handful over miles and miles and miles. So if
You
you
mean
bring it to
The fact that
traveling.
it was what we call now a low incidence group.
Right, but, and so that they were spread over such a wide area,
Yeah.
having a residential school was a solution to bringing all of those students together in one place.
Yeah, yeah.
We
Well,
didn't have
yes,
auxiliary
yes.
teachers then.
Yeah, that's right. That may be one of the reasons, yes. There are other reasons.
Difficult to travel.
Pardon me?
It is difficult to travel if you're blind.
Difficult to travel, at that time particularly, because we didn't have anything like the travel facilities that we have now. So it was necessary to bring these people to one place. There are other reasons.
More efficient way to train them in their specialized skills. for
Yeah,
being a
yeah.
guiding.
Yeah, that's another reason, yes, right. I mean, the task of educating a blind child was considered so overwhelmingly difficult that only a separate facility was considered capable of fulfilling this task. And there's still another reason.
Is there also sort of a ward philosophy still present?
Yeah, it had still its influence, of course, that there were still the idea that the blind are really capable was just in the beginning at that time. And the idea was that they still need complete support. Well, let's look at the other side. Let's look at the public schools that were available at that time. You see, these public schools were not ready to accept anyone who was not conforming to a certain pattern. You know, just as even in our time, there is some resistance still to accept children who deviate from a given pattern, to accept them in public schools. And we know, those of us who are older know, that some 30 or 40 years back, this pattern was very common, that public schools were simply not ready to accept these children. It didn't have any facility, didn't know of any facility that could do justice to them. In fact, the child was considered a tabula rasa, you know, an empty table, an empty blackboard, an empty table. And the teacher had to engrave on this tabula rasa the ideas that made the child educated. Within such a concept, deviations are not accepted. And the public schools were in no way ready for the task of satisfying individual needs of children. This change came only almost 100 years later. So at that time, the only idea was that you have to get the blind together to educate them, because there was no chance for them to gain an education otherwise. Although the self-emancipators of the blind had demonstrated individually that they could get along without school. But they were largely from privileged families. You see, the privileged families who could afford to engage a tutor for a single child who is blind. And this tutor, and many of these blind emancipators were the ones who came from families that were either nobility or were wealthy. But the common man's blind child was not taught anything that could help him to get along in public school. So the idea of public schools is far ahead. Well, we have covered very quickly the historic antecedents which lead to integration. And as I said before, the prerequisite for establishing anything like integration for the blind, or an atmosphere of integration, was the the proven educability of the blind. And this is what the first schools for the blind did in Europe, and that was the schools for the blind, the example of the French school spread to England, to Germany, to Austria, where schools were founded, and particularly in Austria, with which I am more familiar, there was a man by the name of Johann Wilhelm Klein, who wrote the first textbook on the education of blind children in the early 1820s. So, and then it spread to the United States, to America, to North America. And the first schools for the blind in this country were founded in almost at the same time in Boston and in New York, and shortly thereafter in Philadelphia or near Philadelphia. These are the three great Eastern schools which are still private schools. Perkins School for the Blind, the New York Institute for the Education of the Blind, and Overbrook School for the Blind are the three Eastern schools that are still private schools. While from Perkins particularly, the idea spread that states have a responsibility to care of education of blind children. And Samuel Gridley Howe, perhaps the greatest educator of the blind that was produced in the United States, went with a group of blind children who were educated at Perkins, went, for instance, to Ohio and demonstrated there before the legislators what he achieved with the blind children, to demonstrate to them that they are educable, that it is worthwhile to found a school for the blind. And this way, schools for the blind were founded in various other states. Some of them sooner, some of them later. In California, it was rather late, but California became a part of the United States only rather late. Now, the education for blind children was provided in residential schools, and we could follow the development of residential schools, which was from closed schools to more or less open schools. By closed schools, I mean schools that considered that they have provided everything for the blind child. The open schools were the ones who knew that they cannot provide and should not provide everything, but should call upon the community for certain support services and should assist children in keeping touch with their environment, particularly with their families. So the development of residential schools until the time public schools came about was that from closed residential schools to more or less open residential schools. By 1910, some efforts were made to provide education for blind children in public schools. And the idea was that it should not be necessary to separate these children from their families, but they should be able to remain with their families, and some of the larger cities found it within their responsibility to establish schools for blind, classes for blind children in their regular public school setting. The first ones were established in Chicago. They were separated classes in a public school. From there it went to Cleveland, Cincinnati, Detroit, and to the Middle West it spread first, and then it came to the east, and then came to the west. And by 1910, there were about 10 to 15% of the blind children educated in public school facilities, while 85 to 90% remained in residential schools. And this numerical or percentage distribution, 15 to 20% in public schools, 80 to 85% in residential schools, prevailed for quite a few decades, until the 1940s and 50s. At that time, retrolental fibroplasia became one of the main causes of blindness among young blind children. And retrolental fibroplasia, children knew no differentiation between poor, middle class, or wealthy. A child could become blind as a result of premature birth in any group of the population, in any economic stratum of the population. And the parents of these blind children couldn't understand why they should be separated, why their blind child should be separated from the family. They knew that they were responsible for the blind child. They knew that they can do it. And they exerted pressure upon local boards to engage teachers for blind children within the public school system, so that they could do the same things that were done in some other communities already, in Cleveland particularly, which was a leading city in the development of public school classes, which changed also from separated classes to classes that cooperated with the regular classroom and sent the blind child out to the regular classroom for a part of his or her education. Now these parents knew what they wanted and they got what they wanted. And that change occurred in the 1940s, 50s, early 50s, and is still continuing, particularly in some areas of the United States. Some areas are far ahead, and I must say California is far ahead in that respect, because we have in our state about more than 90% of the children in public schools and about 5 to 10% in the residential schools. So this change occurred, this reversal of percentages, where the majority attended first residential schools and only a small minority public schools, changed to the opposite, with the majority of children attending public schools and the minority attending residential schools. That is the form in which education established integration. Of course, the fact that a blind child is in a public school class per se doesn't guarantee integration. It has to be understood well, it has to be, the blind child needs to be guided toward integration. And this is a task of those teachers who are teaching visually impaired children in the public schools. Shall we make a break now, or shall we?
That's fine.
Because I want to continue with the discussion of integration, and I'm going to discuss with you the forces that favor integration, and then the forces that retard integration. That will be the topic of our next hour's discussion.
Okay.
Well, we are coming to the second part of our discussion, and that is integration. And I will first discuss with you the forces favoring integration. Now, obviously, the first force favoring integration is education. Because only with education is it possible to join the mainstream of society. And as long as there was no education provided for blind children, the chances for them to really mainstream were limited to those individuals who were privileged, either by wealth or status of their parents. Now, we have described the development of residential schools, we have discussed it, and I have mentioned public school education and at least given you some idea of the change in the attendance percentage of children. Now, the public schools, as I mentioned before, were established as separate classes and became gradually more and more integrated. The first form of integration was by sending the children out for certain classes to the regular classroom. But the children were placed in a so-called Braille class. Shortly, it became evident that blind children can also be placed in the regular classroom and return to the so-called resource room, not anymore Braille class, but resource room, and receive their special or have their special needs met in that resource room, where a teacher especially trained in the education of blind children was available. And this teacher not only worked with the individual blind child in areas which the regular classroom teacher could not take care of, but also assisted the regular classroom teacher in giving him or her advice on how best to meet the needs of the blind, individual blind or visually impaired child. Now this changed more and more until blind children are now in most schools placed directly in the regular classroom and have only the resource room and the resource room teacher, as the name says, as a resource assistant. So this is the change that occurred within the public school provision from a relative separation to an integration. But as I stressed before, integration is more than just placing the child in a classroom. The child must also become friendly with his peers within the classroom. And there we have, let's say, varying degrees of integration. Because in some schools, the blind children are well accepted and the teachers make every effort to integrate them with the other children and to really make them part of the regular classroom. In some other schools, they tend to be either overprotective or don't have time enough to satisfy the special needs of the visually impaired child. So, I don't want to give the impression that regular public schools are completely capable of filling the needs of every child. There will always be children who need residential schools because of their special needs, and there will always be children who can get along only in residential schools. Now, this education change within the education of blind children from more or less separated facility to integrated one also showed itself in the trend of teacher education. Teacher education, that means the training of teachers themselves, was provided initially by the residential schools who trained teachers for their own consumption. Thus Perkins School became a teacher training center, the New York Institute for the Education of the Blind, and the Overbrook School. But some other schools also, like the school in Illinois, for instance, provided some training in cooperation with some local colleges. But in general, the teacher training was provided by the residential schools. In the 1940s, 50s, this pattern changed. Regular colleges and universities became ready to establish within their program for teacher training courses dealing with visually impaired children, their social, educational, emotional, and total needs. And this happened first in the East, where colleges became aware of the fact that where colleges engage teachers as instructors for the special training of teachers of the blind, and the West followed. The Middle West and West followed. But gradually, some kind of leadership was taken over by the West, where such people as Mrs. Henderson, Georgia Lee Abel, and others provided a special program. And this special program was special in the sense that it did not differentiate between totally blind and partially seeing students, but provided training for the broad range of visual acuities from 0 to 20/200. Now, this change became possible because the medical profession, that means the ophthalmological profession, changed its attitude toward the use of sight. Some of you may know about sight-saving classes that were conducted for years and years and considered absolutely essential for partially seeing children. And sight-saving was considered the only way in which justice could be done to these children, educationally as well as so far as their eye health is concerned. The medical profession changed its attitude. Well, it was, and this occurred during the 1940s, 50s. Before, it was imperative not to use the sight of the child. So that, for instance, children who wanted to read Braille with their eyes, they had enough sight to read it with their eyes, were prevented from doing it by covering up the hands or by darkening the classroom and things of that kind. The medical profession became convinced gradually that use of the eye does not damage the eye, if it is within normal usage and under favorable conditions. That means favorable conditions, conditions that are favorable to all children, to the sight of all children, to the vision of all children, and not only to the vision of partially seeing children. With this change came the change also from sight-saving classes to classes for the partially seeing or for the visually impaired, and later on simply to classes for visually impaired, for blind and visually impaired children. This change came about in the 1940s and 1950s, and Frida Henderson and Florence Henderson, as well as Georgia Lee Abel, were leading people in that area. I want to revert for a moment to the teacher preparation that I said started out in separate facilities in residential schools, and where many colleges and universities established courses for teachers of visually impaired children. This is now the generally accepted pattern, that it's the teacher training occurs in regular colleges and universities, and that those who want to be trained or educated as teachers for the blind have to go to regular college. Now, the second big area of a force that favors integration, now I let you guess what it could possibly be.
Public attitudes change.
Pardon me?
Public attitudes change. What?
Yeah, that comes later on, and we don't have a handle on that yet. I wish we had.
Parents?
Pardon me?
Parents?
Well, that goes with education also, and with general rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is the second great force toward integration. Because education is the first one, you know, it's for the young, for younger children, for the children during their period of education, and rehabilitation is the big force in assisting those who leave school to become productive members of society. And this was started, really, it began also in residential schools, because the School for the Blind in Paris and also the School for the Blind in Vienna particularly were instrumental in providing workshops for the blind. Workshops first for their own graduates, and gradually these workshops became independent of the schools and were not only training places but also employment places. So rehabilitation started really with, had its origin in the workshop idea. But from there on, it became independent in a way. And this also had a great impetus during the First World War and during the Second World War, where there was need for labor, and many blind people who had not been engaged in industry were accepted in industry because there was scarcity of labor. Most of the adults were in the army, or the capable adults were in the army, so the labor force had to resort to any available possibility. And the visually handicapped first showed in workshops and then in general factories that they can be industrially employed, and employed at the same, on the same level as sighted labor, and with the same risk, or practically the same risk as sighted labor. So this provided the first impetus toward employment of the blind in industry. After the First World War, there were no agencies available to continue what has started during the war, and the blind lost out in their chance to be employed in industry, because agencies for the blind and in general the atmosphere was not yet ready for the employment of blind people in industry unless it was under wartime conditions. The same thing occurred in the Second World War, when there was a great need for labor. The blind were again used in the labor force. But after the Second World War, the agencies for the blind, and federal legislation was available to provide for continued employment of blind people in industry. And this is still a growing process. Rehabilitation established certain definite ways of functioning. There were rehabilitation counselors, there were rehabilitation teachers, there were rehabilitation placement agents, there were rehabilitation centers, and there were rehabilitation workshops. All these became available as a result of the First and Second World War. And in the Second World War, the readiness of the agencies and the readiness of the federal government to provide rehabilitation money promoted the integration of the blind into the working force of the nation. Employment in industry, employment in the professions, and self-employment became the outlets for the vocational and professional education of visually impaired people. This has had great effects, and we are still in the process, and is still an ongoing process, because the blind are still either not employed or underemployed to a large extent, but there are efforts on the federal and on the state level and financed by both in a coordinated program of rehabilitation. Now, so besides education and rehabilitation, I come to the third point, to the third force favoring integration. And I'm not going to let you guess about that, because I had to give it a great deal of thought myself. This is, the third area is progress in reducing the effects of blindness. And there are a number of areas. Can you give me one or the other? Progress in reducing the effects of blindness.
Vaccinations against diseases.
Yeah, vaccination against diseases. Well, I'm not, we'll come to that later on, but it is not one of my first points.
What about technology?
Technology, yes, technological progress, that's right. I mean, there is technological progress, but before we come to that, I have two other points that I want to give you. Reading, the area of reading. Braille reading, we talked about that already. But then came the talking book as a progress, as a technologically based progress. The talking book, where a man that is very well known to me because I was employed by him at the American Foundation for the Blind, Robert B. Irwin, was the moving force. He had the idea of talking books. It came in part from England, but he elaborated on it and convinced the legislation in Washington, the legislators, that they should provide the money for the Library of Congress to provide talking books for the blind. Now, the talking books were first on discs, and the talking books were ahead of the time because they employed 33 revolutions per minute, while the general record industry still had only 78 revolutions per minute. So the talking books were the first discs available to the public with 33 RPM. From then on, we went through a chain of changes from wire recordings to tape recordings, and and to cassette recordings. And now the most popular way of production of talking books is, as I don't have to tell you, I'm sure, is cassettes. Now that is Braille reading. Braille reading also was changed, because in the beginning it was largely full, that means grade 1 Braille. And before international consensus could be reached upon a Braille grade 2 available to in the English speaking, uniformly available in the English speaking countries. It took many years, many decades to develop a consensus until it was reached, and we have now a unified Braille grade 2. Braille grade 3, is it still used the grade 3? Do any of you use Braille grade 3? Phil, is it used to any extent?
Not to a great extent. I think that there are a number of especially college and university students who develop their own grade 3 Braille.
Yeah.
And I think that what you find are lots and lots of variations of grade 3 depending on...
Individually adapted. I mean, Sally, you certainly have had your own Braille and your own Braille abbreviations for your purposes especially. Well, that's reading. The second, among the progress in reducing the effects of blindness, what else reduces the effects of blindness considerably? Perhaps the greatest handicap caused by blindness is what? In the area of
Social attitude. Mobility.
that's it, of mobility. Yeah. Mobility is really the area in which blindness creates the greatest handicap. And mobility instruction, dog guides, as well as the long cane use, are of comparatively recent origin. It's amazing how productive the 1940s were in producing changes in our field. In the 1940s, as a result of the Second World War, a man became aware, a man who was concerned with the training of war-blinded soldiers, became concerned, Dr. Richard Hoover, about the lack of progress in teaching mobility to newly blinded people. And he had a group of newly blinded people who were in the prime of their life and wanted to go ahead and to return to their previous pattern of life. Well, out of that grew the development of mobility instruction. And this mobility instruction is probably the greatest single progress that has been made since Braille. I mentioned dog guides. Of course, dog guides are also used by some blind people, but most blind people rely upon their own learning the long cane technique, and they are using the long cane to great effect. And the third area is that of general technical progress. That means now I am not referring to anything that were specifically designed for the blind, like the Braille writer, for instance. But those things that are available to the general public, but are of special significance to the blind. Now I'll let you guess of those. Name some.
Elevators.
Pardon me?
Elevators.
Yeah. One.
Radio.
Pardon me?
Radio.
Radio is an obvious one. The radio. I mean, I remember when I became a teacher of blind children in the 1920s. We had to read to the children the most important news of the days from the newspaper at 8 o'clock. Between 8 and 8:15, one of the teachers was assigned responsibility for a whole week to read to the children the most important news. And that was considered very progressive at that time. Now, who would think of that? I mean, they have access through the radio to all the news they want. Not only blind children, but blind people have access. So the radio is a special boon to the blind. Television. You know, when television came into existence, there was great fear among those who worked with the blind that it might do away with the radio. It might replace the radio, and the blind would be on an unequal level because they couldn't see the screen while the sight people could. Well, these fears have been unfounded because the radio continues to be a source of information particularly, and television is used by many blind people as a source of information as well as of entertainment. Well, what other things?
Public transportation.
Public transportation, correct, yes. Public transportation that has been changed so greatly. I mean, I refer to it when we said that transportation was not available to the children in the 1780s, 1790s, first school for the blind in Paris. The transportation facilities that we have now are making blind people far more mobile than they would be without them. Transportation facilities. What else?
The sidewalk levels have been lowered to ramp.
Right?
in some
Yes, yes.
places, Making
I
it
mean,
easier.
consideration of the needs of physically handicapped people in general has also helped blind people, because the sidewalks have now these gradual approaches so that a blind person can easier manage to cope with them. But there are 2 or 3 that you haven't mentioned. Think a little harder.
Communication devices,
Such as?
telephone.
That's right. No, telephone, of course the telephone, you know. I mean, the telephone is a real boon to the blind. You don't have to walk over to the neighbor anymore, you could just call. And you can visit at any time with your friend who may be 100 miles away if you can afford to call. And to one who is next door or in the next street, like just call it. The telephone is so much more important to blind people than it is to sighted people. The telephone, what else? Still something that you use practically every day. Typewriter. The typewriter, of course, the typewriter. The regular typewriter. Blind people learn to type just as seeing people learn to type blind. You know, without watching the keyboard, they learn to type. And the blind learn it, of course, and they learn it in school and become very efficient in it. And it is a very effective means of communication. So we have these things. And then I have, of course, transportation that we mentioned already. So these are the main areas where general technical progress has led to great progress in general. Then, public policy. Public policy is the 4th element. There are laws to compensate for the effects of blindness in the personal life of the individual, and laws to compensate for the effects of blindness in the economic life of the individual. Now, what would you say? Give me one. I have to speed up my discussion because we won't have time to discuss forces unfavorable to integration, but I want to come to that. Now, what would be a law, a federal law, let's say, to compensate for the effects of blindness in the personal life of an individual. The white cane law, yeah. It's typical of that. And in the economic life,
Rehabilitation Act 501.
yeah. And, for instance, the readers. Supply of readers to students and professional people in general. And support of rehabilitation is part of federal law to compensate for the economic life of the individual. The fifth force, and I have to be short on that, and I'm sorry, are the self-organizations of the blind. That means those organizations which are not only for the blind, but also of and by the blind. And in this, I must ask you to read up in my book on this, when you have time to do it, because it describes the growth of the National Federation of the Blind, which is perhaps the most important agency. It was for many years the most important agency providing self-help and self-organization for the blind. And it is so much easier for an agency representative to come before legislators and say, we the blind, instead of having to say, they the blind. But there are many other forces and the issues are very broad, and I would say that I must really ask you to read up on that. Now, we come to forces unfavorable to integration. Now I want you to think of one or the other that you consider unfavorable to integration. It has been mentioned before. Attitudes of the public toward the blind and toward blindness. Many of these attitudes date back to prehistoric times. You know, the attitude that a blind person is responsible for his blindness, the attitude that blind people are incapable of producing, incapable of fending for themselves, that they are deviate, is still pretty widespread. And we find it in the person who walks on the street and runs into a blind person and tells him, you shouldn't be on the street. It still occurs. Just recently I was told by a blind person that it occurred to him. Attitudes of the seeing and attitudes of the blind. Because society, attitudes of society, broad attitudes, have their effects not only on the seeing, on the environment, but also on the blind themselves. This idea of living up to expectations holds true not only of living up to expectations, but also of living down to expectations. You know, low expectations of the public create in blind people a feeling of inefficiency, a feeling of inferiority. And many blind people give in to that. And rather than running against the attitudinal stream of society, they submit to it and become and pattern their lives according to what it is to be expected. That means low expectations. And these low expectations, many blind people make their own and become victims of society's attitudes by accepting these attitudes. There's a very good book by Scott, The Making of the Blind Man, you should read. You will get a deeper understanding of this whole problem, of the effects of society's attitudes on the blind themselves. Forces unfavorable to integration is also economic forces. Now, what do I mean by that, by economic forces? That some, employment, yes. Employment of the blind, there is still a great deal of resistance toward employing a blind person. And all kinds of excuses are made out of prejudices toward the blind, out of negative attitudes toward the blind. Excuses are made by saying, he can't produce, he may have an accident, or may have more accidents, although all statistically, all these facts have been disproven. The blind are productive when they are given adequate jobs after adequate job training, and the blind are productive in not causing more accidents than any sighted group of equal training and experience would have. As the third force, economic forces, of course, the idea of the blind are the last to be hired and the first to be fired is still a very active. Very often, and it's not only pertaining to the blind, but the handicapped in general are victims of this idea, and of this procedure. It's not an idea anymore, it's a procedure. When there is a reduction of the working force, the ones who are first dismissed are the ones who are blind and the ones who are incapable of taking care of themselves, or considered that way. Now, the third negative force, or third force unfavorable to integration, is the agency system. And I have mentioned the book by Scott before, The Making of the Blind Man. And this agency system is described very well in that book. That means it produces, the agency system produces the blind person whom it purports to assist. That means it has to describe the blind person as an inferior person in order to raise money, in order to prove its existence. And this carries over to the blind person himself, who becomes a product cut to the prejudices of the agency system. The sheltered shop, the separated recreational programs, and the other services that are often needlessly offered to the blind in order to attract them and in order to give the public the impression of a comprehensive service, rendered by the organization, are molding the image of the blind person who is the client of the agency system. And this is very sharply discussed by Scott. So what I have given you only here as in a general outline needs to be supported if you need further information. And you find all these sources mentioned in my book, The Changing Status of the Blind. I have to finish with an ambiguous force. That means with a force that has the potential for the best, but is still on the level of a questionable positive force. and that is the program of public assistance to the blind. In general, I would say, to give you an idea of my reasoning, it is this. If public assistance would adequately provide for those who are in need or compensate for the unavoidable economic disadvantage of some blind people, I said, if it would adequately provide for it, it would be a very positive force. But if it provides inadequately for it, that means if it allows the blind only to move from a level of poverty to a pure subsistence level, it is not enough. Because it is still keeping the blind on a very, and those blind who cannot fend for themselves, either because of their own additional handicaps or because of societal attitudes. If it doesn't provide for them an adequate public assistance program, as long as that is not provided, public assistance will remain an ambiguous force. So with this I would like to finish my discussion, but we have still a few minutes left, won't we, Sally, Bill, for any questions that you might have. Shoot.
What's the biggest mistake teachers make?
Pardon me?
What is the biggest mistake you think teachers make? Teachers of
The
visually...
biggest mistake that teachers can make?
Teachers of visually handicapped
Yeah.
children.
The biggest and perhaps the most tempting mistake is to do things for the child rather than let him do him or her do it. Even if it takes more time. You see, that in my experience, I would say that is perhaps the biggest mistake. That if you do that too often, it is a violation of the child's chance to develop.
Who was the first blind person you ever knew?
The first blind person whom I ever knew
Yeah.
is a man who came to a public park in Linz, which is a smaller town in Austria where I grew up until I went to the university in Vienna. And I must have been 5, 6, 7 years old. And the man was a blind man who had a dog. Of course, it was not a guide dog, because at that time dog guides were not available. But he had trained the dog to guide him in a primitive way, not like what we have now, well-trained dog. But he was a man, a blind man, and he went to the park and sat down and always came with a big book. And he opened the book and he would start reading aloud. And while he was doing that, we kids surrounded him and listened to him. And that's my first memory of a blind person.
He just make up stories?
Pardon me?
He made up stories?
No, he read it in Braille. He read in Braille. I remember very well how he was reading Braille. How he was moving his fingers over the page on which pimples were. And I mean, that's the way it appeared to me. And he was reading for us aloud, and there were always 5, 6, 7 children around him, and we were sitting there at his feet, and he was reading. And this is my first memory of a blind person. Later on I met, of course, when I became a teacher, I met more, but I also remember that not very far from where we live, was a school for blind children, Catholic school for blind children in Linz, in Austria. Later on, I became acquainted with Monsignor Kermersdorf, was his name. And, he was delighted when he heard that I was going to education of blind children.
How about the most memorable blind person you know?
Helen Keller. Helen Keller, I think. And next to her, I would have to mention two. One was Chick Hanbrook, and the other one was Robert Beaver.
Memories of Helen Keller?
Pardon me?
Memories of Helen Keller?
Yeah, very vivid ones. Because I met her in New York the first time in 1931. There was a World Conference for the Blind in New York, and I attended that. And I met her, I was introduced to her, and we talked. I was living in Austria. I had come over to the United States on the year's Rockefeller Research Fellowship. And I met Helen at that time, and she was with Anne Sullivan Macy at that time. We talked. She was interested in what was happening in Austria. She knew about the Vienna School for the Blind, and we discussed it at some length. But then I went back to Austria, and when I came to the United States in 1938, I became more closely acquainted with her, because she was so interested in what I had to report about coming back to the country that was under Nazi domination. And by that time I was with the American Foundation for the Blind, and she dropped in my office very frequently, and we discussed things, and then I had lunches with her, and became better acquainted. And then her visit to California, to Berkeley, was a unique opportunity to really be with her for a few days, from 8 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock in the evening.
When you say adequately provide society, what are you getting at as far as provide financially adequately? Right now,
How far it should go?
well, yeah, because if we went provisionally impaired, it'd probably go across the board.
Yeah, go across the board.
Right.
In a rich society that can spend so much for armament, it should not be impossible to provide for people who are poverty stricken. This is our great shortcoming, as I see it.
Who were the other two people you mentioned at Keller?
The other people were Dr. Tenbrook, a blind professor at the University of California, and the founder of the National Federation of the Blind. He was a great lawyer and still greater orator and a leader of the blind, and a real self-emancipator of the blind, because he provided leadership for blind people and became the spiritus movens in the movement of the blind toward independent organization. As I said, for an organization for, of, and by the blind. This was one. And the other one was Dr. Robert B. Irwin, the executive director of the American Foundation for the Blind, who was very instrumental in promoting public school education for visually impaired children. He was one of the teachers in Cleveland. This is why I mentioned Cleveland before. And he is really the promoter, almost the inventor, you can call him, of the talking book, and was the greatest promoter of legislation for the blind, social legislation, economic legislation, and rehabilitation legislation. So that was Robert E. Irving.
How can the unfavorable forces of the agency system be turned around to become favorable forces?
By limiting its services to those who are essentially needed for the blind, and not providing the ones that seeing people conceive as needed by the blind. And by not wanting to mold the lives of blind people according to their preconceived idea of what a blind person should be or must be.
Couldn't that assessment be made of the rehabilitation community, though, equally as well? The desire
To a certain
mold-
extent, yes. To a certain extent, yes. Because the rehabilitation community is very much influenced by blind organizations, by organizations of the blind. Or let me say, by blind organizations of the blind. You see, I mean, there is a lot of this kind of patterning the blind client according to the preconceived idea of whatever rehabilitation agent handles him. Did you right?
So I had a number of blind students that wanted to get into the military. And do you know if anybody's ever pressed that as far as...
The military?
Yeah.
No. No.
And that's obviously discriminating.
Well, yeah, not into the fighting force, but in the support force you find blind.
Well, they couldn't get in, period.
They couldn't get into the army or navy.
No,
That-
no. They could, in Israel, they have all.
Pardon me?
Israel has, in their armed forces, they accept everybody, no matter the handicap, and they obviously, there's other things besides shooting the gun in the military. And I had students that wanted to get into the service, but were not allowed to.
Well, in Israel, of course, Israel has a continuing need for labor. And in that sense, in that way, it is different from most of the Western countries, economically different from most of the Western countries. The Western countries have great unemployment. And I'm afraid that Israel, if and when Israel has more unemployment, it might change there too.
I just thought that was discriminating, because they wanted
Well,
to
it
get
is,
in
there is,
service.
of course, there is. I mean, there is certain, let's not be Pollyannic, because there is a certain degree, and there are certain areas in which a blind person cannot function efficiently. I mean, a blind person who wants to become a painter cannot do it. A blind person who wants to become a bus driver cannot do it. And there are certain areas, I mean, where the blind would be at such disadvantage that it wouldn't serve their interest to train them for it. The military.
But in the military, there's secretaries, there's pilots,
Yeah,
there's,
sure.
they're in the service. And,
Yeah. Well,
you know,
in military support services, we have had many blind people in the United States because some of the industrial establishments in the United States were practically only war-oriented and had blind people serving.
Is that just in times of war or also in times like now?
Pardon me?
These people, I think that, Robert, these students of yours who wanted to get into the military, this was during times of peace, not during.
Right, they wanted,
So, so you're saying that yes, there are many blind people in the military. Is that during times of war and during times of peace, or just during times of war when there's a great need for any individual to be?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, so far I have never thought of that problem. That is a big problem of the blind. I think most of them go into the military because they are forced to go in. I mean, most of our young people who join the army are not joining it, but are joined into the army. So the blind are in that way, they are in a fortunate position. They don't have to be afraid of joining the army.
You had mentioned that in places like Israel where there's such a need for people, let's say in the armed forces, and so they will accept people regardless of disability, etc. Does that philosophy carry over into their economic environment as well? The philosophy of
employment
yes.
in open industry, I don't really know. I have not followed the progress. I was once familiar with the situation in Israel because I was asked by the vocational rehab in Washington to go to Israel and look it over. But at that time, I must say that it was far from satisfactory. But it may have changed, and the conditions certainly must have improved a great deal, and I think the employment conditions for blind people in Israel are certainly not worse than they are in some of the most progressive Western countries.
Based on what you've seen happen throughout, based on what you yourself have observed through your lifetime, would you like to do any predicting about what you think will happen in the near future and in the far future in terms of employment or life for blind people?
I don't indulge in predictions that are not really founded on precedents, And we have seen certain things come up in our field that were so influential and could not have been predicted, like return to fabrication, or the effects of a war. Sometimes, in most respects, negative, but in some respects, positive also. I don't know what will come out of our space research. There may be possibilities for reading of which we have now no idea right now, because the path has not been opened here. So I think we are, predictions usually are too risky. I don't want to indulge in predictions that have no basis.
Let me ask you then, how you think we best help parents?
How we best help parents? By providing well-trained and knowledgeable and sympathetic counselors. Because there's no doubt that parents have to cope with the fact that they have produced a blind child. And in this coping, they need assistance. In this coping, they and the blind child, the blind infant, need assistance. And this can only be provided by well-trained and sympathetic. I stress that, because training per se is not necessarily the only cause.
What country do you think provides the best services for visually impaired?
That's very difficult to say. That's very difficult to say. I don't know enough about all countries. But offhand I can say that our country is certainly among the foremost countries in the world in providing adequate services, as inadequate as they may be.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. May we all
Good luck to all of you.
Thank you.